Is it that time again? Yes, it is. Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about the productivity of Congress and state legislatures. Do we really have a do-nothing Congress? The phrase do-nothing Congress can be traced all the way back to 1948, when Democrat Harry Truman was in the midst of his election campaign to secure a full term as president after succeeding FDR when he died at the beginning of his fourth term for president. Uh, After the end of a special session that Truman called that year for the Republican-controlled Congress, a reporter asked President Truman, "Would you say it was a do-nothing session, Mr. President?" To which Truman gleefully replied, "I would say it was a do-nothing session." Now, whether or not that was accurate, this depiction of a do-nothing Congress has stuck throughout the decades, though to varying degrees for each congressional session. But is it accurate? Does Congress really twiddle its thumbs or sit on its hands or just generally act obstinately? Well, I'm not going to say that we're going to answer those questions once and for all, because as you'll see and hear on this episode, answering whether or not Congress is productive isn't so straightforward. You can also look at it through the prism of the entire legislative body, or just one chamber, or specific legislators, to name a few dimensions. But that being said, the goal is to get you, the listeners and viewers, some steps closer to answering that question yourself. And we're going to extend this to state legislatures as well, because undoubtedly some, if not all of them, have been lamented as do-nothing legislatures as well. So today we'll talk about some ways legislative processes can differ between states and how that can affect productivity, at least some of the ways that we typically define productivity, as well as differences between state legislatures and Congress, and some data on bills introduced and enacted in the states and Congress, because usually productivity is thought of as how many bills did they enact from how many did they introduce, and some more normative and philosophical questions about what defines a productive legislature. Here we go. So, not going to get too much into all of the finer workings of the legislative process in general. Focus on that maybe for another episode. But do want to highlight some of the key differences between legislative processes, because it matters for this discussion on productivity. Legislative processes look largely the same or similar between states and Congress, and also just between the states amongst themselves. But there are some quirks to pay attention to. And there's actually quite a few of them that we could go over, a lot of them that we could go over. But for time's sake, I'm just covering four things. So first of all, talk about legislators needed for a quorum. So a quorum is a minimum number of legislators that are required for chamber business to proceed, especially for voting on bills. If you don't have the quorum, you can't really officially conduct business. Now, in what is considered a quorum differs from legislature to legislature. Quorums or the quorum needed for both chambers of Congress is just a simple majority, and most state legislatures are the same as that. But Massachusetts only needs 2/5 of its state Senate and 3/8 of its state House to be considered a quorum. So they don't even need half of their chambers. Meanwhile, Indiana, Oregon, Tennessee, and Texas, their state legislatures chambers need to have 2/3 people present. So, but within a state, though, a quorum requirement might be different depending on what activity is being done by that legislative body or the type of legislation that they're talking about. For example, in Wisconsin, normally you just need a simple majority for a quorum, but when it comes to dealing with budget bills, they need 2/3 of the chambers to be there. So, what is the impact of a quorum on productivity? Well, if a quorum can't be reached, you can't vote on bills. You can't introduce them. You can't really do anything, really, except yell and shake your fist at the people who aren't showing up. And because of quorum requirements, sometimes the minority party has strategically used a walkout to prevent the majority party from voting on bills and conducting certain business. They say, well, if they're just going to ram things down our throats, at least in their eyes. If they're going to ram things down our throats, we're just not going to show up, so they can't actually do anything. But in a lot of cases, this isn't feasible because the minority party a lot of times doesn't have enough members to prevent a quorum, especially in those states where you just need a simple majority for a quorum, or in Congress where you need a simple majority for a quorum. You rarely have a third party or no party uh, elected official in those seats, so they can't really tip the balance in a way where they could stage a walkout. But whereas in a place like Indiana and Oregon and Tennessee and Texas, where you need 2/3 to reach a quorum, it's a little bit easier, or I should say, it's much easier. Uh, in Oregon, at least, it's easier because it's a little bit more balanced. Even though Oregon is definitely a Democratic state, it's definitely a blue state. It's there. There is still a big enough Republican presence that they can sometimes stage a walkout, which actually they did. Oregon Republicans in 2021 and 2023 were able to do that, and on the Democratic side, Minnesota Democrats were just able to do that with the end of 2024 through the start of this year, 2025. It ended. The quorum requirements have had noticeable impacts on productivity, for example, in Oregon and Minnesota. Another key difference between legislatures that can affect their productivity is when you can file bills. Most state legislatures, 41 of them to be exact, allow for what is called pre-filing of bills, although Minnesota only allows it for sessions in even-numbered years. But pre-filing of bills is when a legislature puts a bill up, or officially puts the bill into consideration for when the legislature actually starts, or the session actually starts. The session hasn't actually started yet. It's during the downtime between sessions, but uh, the but they do it to get ahead of things. And it's not like with Congress, where Congress meets almost the entire year with the exception of a couple of recesses. Vast majority of state legislatures are far shorter. Their sessions are far shorter than that. Uh, but even for states that allow pre-filing, there are stipulations as to when they can be filed. For example, there's different times for when pre-filing can actually begin. It's not like you can necessarily do it any time during the off season, for lack of a better term. Although some states do let you do that, but some states they only let you do it at a certain point. For example, Utah, you can start pre-filing 60 days after the end of the previous session. And then there's also different times when pre-filing must end. So you can't necessarily just pre-file up to the beginning of the legislative session. You might have to stop it some days or weeks beforehand. So how does pre-filing impact productivity? Well, it allows legislators to get a drafted bill ready for a session as soon as the session begins. They don't have to use up as much session time to draft bills, and other legislators can already look at the bill to get some sense of what it is. The pre-filing uh, is a way for you to just get the bill out there ready to go, so you don't have to spend all that time drafting and as much time trying to get people to support it. Another key difference state legislatures and between state legislatures and Congress is uh, which legislative committees exist in those state legislatures, because each state, some states have committees that don't exist in other states. Or, for example, the appropriations committee in one state may be broken down into different subcommittees that another state doesn't have. And you'll see different committees and subcommittees within each state compared to another state. And this affects which committees a bill has to go through before it gets to the whole chamber floor, because bills have to go through committees that deal with that bill's subject matter. So if it's K through 12 education, or healthcare, or veterans, whatever the bill has to deal with, it has to go to those committees. And if it has to deal with more committees, it's gets a little bit more bogged down. So what is the impact of these difference in legislative committees? It's, well, if you may need more committees to sign off on a bill. It might need to go through a subcommittee before the full committee if it's a large enough committee for a large enough subject area. Whereas some other states, it might just be a more straightforward process, just one committee to get through and then gets to the rest of the chamber floor. And then the last thing we'll cover in terms of how much it impacts legislative productivity is the robustness of the legislative staff. So in Washington, D.C., and in all the state capitals, there's various kinds of staff on hand in the legislature. There's committee staff, so the staff that is for a specific committee, like the Armed Forces Committee in Congress. There are staff members specifically for that committee. Chamber staff, so for a House and for a Senate, specifically for those chambers, you might see staffs there, or staff members just for that chamber. Party staff, so Republican Party members, Democratic Party members, might be Democratic House reps and then Democratic senators and then Republican House reps and then Republican senators. Legislative aides that are for specific legislators. And all these vary considerably across these legislatures. There's also some policy arms that are either officially part of the legislature or they're closely tied to a legislature that assist in policy analysis. But yeah, there's tons of these kinds of people on Capitol Hill. States with full-time legislatures tend to have more robust staff because there's a lot of legislatures that are considered part-time. So these lawmakers tend to meet for much fewer days than a full-time legislature. They have less compensation. They have smaller staffs. So the impact on productivity in terms of the robustness of legislative staff is, theoretically at least, if you have more staff members, it helps legislators be more productive because these staff members provide more information on bills to these legislators. Take care of other duties that the legislator doesn't have to take care of themselves. They have to set up meetings with another legislator, for example. You'll see a lot more of these kinds of people on Capitol Hill for Congress. You might see them in a more well-funded legislature, state legislature like New York's or California's, but you don't necessarily get this big staff in other states with part-time legislatures. So those four things are four key differences between state legislatures and the state legislature and Congress that can really affect how productive those legislators are. So now that we've talked about some of the more qualitative things that affect the productivity of legislators, and productivity here, for the sake of argument, we're measuring productivity based on how many bills were introduced and the percentage of those that were enacted. So first, we're going to cover congressional bills, and GovTrack has data. That's GOV track, has data going back to the 93rd Congress, which was 1973 to 1974, on how far bills went. So it includes enacted legislation, passed resolutions, whether it got a vote, whether it failed to pass, if they were vetoed, or they were introduced, but they just didn't go anywhere. And I'm not going to bore you with every single legislative sessions or congressional sessions number of bills introduced and how many were the percentage that were enacted, although I'll give you some real top line info in a minute. But I will say that if you were to visualize it, the percentage of bills that were enacted and to an extent also the number of bills that were introduced kind of ebbs and flows throughout time. But there was a particular dip in the number that were introduced in the late 90s and early 2000s. But a more in-depth look at the GovTrack analysis. On average, when we're talking about the highest activity by month in a congressional term, we saw the highest percentage of bills introduced in the first month of a congressional term, so the January of the first session. The highest percentage of bills enacted was in the October of the second session, so near the end of that congressional term, coming right up onto not necessarily midterm elections, but federal elections. followed by December of that second session, so the month right after, and then December of the first session. So coming right up to the end of the calendar year is when you see a spike of legislation being enacted. And in the case of the second session, since it's coming right up on election time, suddenly you see legislators get a little bit more antsy about making sure to pass legislation conveniently. But also, I mean, the term is about to end, and so they need to get, if they're going to get legislation passed, they need to get it passed then. So in terms of top and bottom 5%, in terms, let me rephrase this. The top and bottom 5 congressional sessions in terms of the percent of enacted legislation. So bills that were passed divided by the bills that were introduced since the start of that 93rd Congress, 1973 to 74. So highest percent of enacted bills. Number one was the 100th Congress, which was 1987 to 1988. That was 8.9%. The second highest was the 115th Congress, which was 2017 to 2018. That was 8.0%. Third, 99th Congress, 1985 to 86, 8.0%. Again, just the decimal place is a little bit lower. Fourth, 101st Congress, 1989 to 1990, 7.7%. And then the fifth one was the 98th Congress, 1983 to 1984, and that was 7.4%. So there was if we're talking about percentage of enacted bills, the Congresses that were the most productive in that regard, 4 of the top 5 were in the 80s. So that's the highest percentage of enacted bills. Now, on to the other end. Which Congresses since that 93rd Congress saw the lowest percent of enacted bills? So the lowest percentage goes to the 118th Congress, which was 2023 to 2024. So it was the last Congress that we just had. That was 3.2%. In second place was the 94th Congress, which was 1975 to 76. That was 4.0%. Third place was 112th Congress. I put 112 ND instead of 112 TH. 2011 to 2012, that was 4.1%. The fourth place was 113th, 2013 to 2014, which was 4.2%. And then the 93rd Congress, which was 1973 to 1974, the beginning of this analysis, which was 4.3%. So the percentage of enacted bills in Congress for this period over the past about 52 years now, it ranged anywhere from 3.2% to 8.9%. And then now if we're talking about just total legislation introduced, the highest number that were introduced, the 93rd Congress had over 26,000 bills. The 94th Congress had over 24,000. The 95th Congress had over 22,000. The 118th Congress had over 19,000. And then the 117th Congress had, which was 2021 to 2022, that was closing in on 18,000. So the 118th Congress had the lowest percentage of enacted bills, but it had the fourth highest number of bills introduced. But you saw from the beginning of this analysis that 93rd Congress, 1973 to 1974, and then the couple of Congresses after, there was a lot of bills introduced. There were a lot of bills introduced. Meanwhile, the lowest number of bills introduced was the 104th Congress, which was just under 8,000. The 105th Congress, which was 1997 to 1998, that was somewhat over 9,000. It's over 9,000. 103rd, 1993 to 1994. 1993 was when I was born. Woohoo! Somewhat under 10,000 is about 9,800. The 113th Congress, 2013 to 2014. 10,600 thereabouts, and then the in fifth place was the 107th Congress, 2001 to 2002, 10,789. So like I said earlier, the late 90s to the early 2000s saw a major dip in the number of bills introduced, and then it kind of came back up. So to go back over those again real quick, highest percentage of enacted bills was 8.9%, 8.0%, 8.0%, 7.7%, and 7.4%. Lowest percentage of enacted bills was 3.2% to 4.0% to 4.1% to 4.2% to 4.3%. And then for top and bottom, a number of pieces of legislation introduced was a little over 26,000 to a little over 24,000 to somewhat over 22,000 to somewhat over 19,000, and then to somewhat close to 18,000, a little bit under 18,000. And then the lowest number of introduced bills was just under 8,000 to a little over 9,000 to closing in on 10,000 to about 10,600, and then a little bit closer to 11,000 for fifth place. So that's going to cover the congressional side. Now, what about the state legislative side? What are the statistics on the success of state legislative bills there? Like with Congress, for argument's sake, we'll measure productivity based on how many bills were introduced and the percentage of those that were enacted. Unfortunately, though, it is more difficult to study state legislature productivity and to compare them to Congress because there's a lot more data that you have to research because it's 50 legislatures. It's not thoroughly studied like with Congress. Federal government, federal politics get a lot more study inherently. And even when state legislatures have been studied, it can be sometimes tedious to find the info. There's also just much more variety in the rules and laws that govern legislative procedures. Legislative procedures look largely the same across legislatures, but there are some key differences in those as well. Different partisan and group dynamics between states. So you have a really heavily Democratic state like Hawaii, then you have a heavily Republican state like Wyoming, one that's a bit more split like Michigan. So bunch of different ones that you have to consider, different partisan and ideological and group realities that you have to account for in those, varying standards, and varying standards as to what constitutes productivity, which we'll definitely get into at the end of this. But all that being said, we do have at least a few studies that we can point to. I'm only going to focus on a couple of them that center on how many bills a whole chamber or legislature passed. There are some studies I found that were focusing more on individual legislators. So I'm going to skip those for today because only have so much time to cover all this stuff. But I'm going to point to a study by Quorum, not like the Quorum we talked about before, an actual company called Quorum. They're a government affairs company, and they do things like bill tracking and a lot of different kinds of software for political groups. But they had a study where on average from 2011 to 2015, at least I think this is what it was for those years. The study didn't explicitly say it was those years, but it did have a chart for them. On average, from that 2011 to 2015 time frame, state legislatures introduced 23 times the number of bills that Congress did. States overall averaged about 128,000 bills per year. However, must account for the fact that there are 50 state legislatures, and the vast majority of them meet for a much shorter session than Congress, and they also don't start sessions at the same time. Most of them begin in January, but you do have some that start in a different month. But then it also, that Quorum study covers has an analysis on the first half of 2016. So I'm guessing this study, it didn't say specifically, but this study came out in like late 2016. But in the first half of 2016, there were just over 63,000 state legislative bills introduced, 63,018 to be exact. Top 5 states by amount of legislation introduced: New Jersey, which had over 6,300. New York was about 4,700. Illinois was about 3,500. Montana was just over 3,000. And then Mississippi was closing in on 2,800. Top 5 states in enactment rate of legislation. So, how many bills were enacted divided by how many were introduced. Arkansas had 94% passed. And Arkansas is a very red state. So, that being so lopsided towards one party is probably pretty easy to have a higher enactment rate. More bills that are going to be introduced and heard are going to be coming from the Republican Party. And it'd be the same thing if it was a heavily Democratic state. Uh, although not quite to that degree of legislative enactment. So number 1 was Arkansas with a 94% enactment rate. Number 2 was South Dakota at 56%. So still a lot of bills being passed, but a considerable drop off. Colorado, 55%. Number 4 was Utah, 52%. And then number 5, Wyoming, was 44%. So in that first half of 2016 analysis, 19.3% of state Senate bills and 13.3% of state House bills were enacted on average, but just 3.6% of U.S. Senate bills and 1.9% of U.S. House bills were enacted. So, very stark difference. But again, remember, a lot of those state legislatures, they only meet for that certain time period. A lot of state legislatures have a session that's 2 to 6 months long, so they kind of have to get all that done in that time frame, whereas Congress has the whole year. And then another study I want to highlight is from Fiscal Note, which has some similarities to Quorum. They're another government affairs company that includes services like bill tracking. In their most effective states legislative report from 2021, they found that overall about 150,000 bills were introduced in all 50 states that year, and 33,000 of them were passed. So there was about a 21% enactment rate. Top and bottom 5 in number of introduced bills. Top 5 in introduced bills was New York with about 16,800. Massachusetts at second place was 13,400, or a little bit closer to 13,500. Number 3, Texas was a little over 11,000. Number 4, New Jersey was 10,800-ish. And then number 5, Illinois was about 8,700. And then the bottom 5 was Alaska with just 436. So stark contrast, but Alaska has one of the shortest legislative sessions in all the states. But Alaska was the lowest introduced bills with 436. Number 2 was Wyoming with 441. 3 was South Dakota with 550. Delaware was 4th place with 636. And then Colorado was 5th with 678. And then top and bottom 5 in percentage of enacted bills. So top 5 in percent of enacted bills. Number 1 was Colorado with about 81.3%. Louisiana was second place with 68%. Number 3, Utah, 65.4%. Number 4, Arkansas, 60.4%. Number 5, North Dakota was 58.9%. And then bottom 5 in enacted legislation, number 1, Massachusetts was 0.41%. So that was another one of those cases where tons of introduced legislation, very, very few actually passed. So again, the lowest percentage of enacted bills was Massachusetts, 0.41%, followed by Minnesota, 1.22%, then Missouri, 2.75%, then Pennsylvania with 4.1%, and then New Jersey with about 4.2%. So if we use the data for Congress in 2021, given that it was the same year, 11,302 bills and resolutions were introduced in the 2021 session, and 833 of them passed. So 7.4% passage rate. So only New York and Massachusetts' state legislatures introduced more bills than Congress had that year. Texas was very close to having as many as Congress did, but 45 states had a higher rate of enacting introduced bills than Congress did in 2021. It's an interesting contrast with how very few states actually introduced more bills than Congress did, but almost all the states had a higher rate of enacting introduced bills than Congress did. So, all in all, if our metric is for productivity is purely how many bills are introduced and passed, and that's all there is to it, there's a mix of state legislatures that are more productive than Congress and others that are less productive. But you may ask yourself then, well, why do so many bills die so early? I mean, it just seems pointless to have so many bills if you know so many of them are going to die. It's inevitable that most bills aren't going to make it to the end, and lots of them die even in the committee stage. And the committee stage is very, very early. It's one of the earliest parts of the process. After you draft the bill and you introduce it, it goes to the committee, and vast majority of them do not even make it out of there. So why does that happen so much? There are several big reasons, and you can find more than these, but I want to highlight four of them specifically for why the demise of bills often is so early, or even if it's later on down the road. Uh, but one big thing is the time constraints. Time is a valuable resource because of how finite it is. You sometimes hear the phrase that time's the most valuable resource that you have. It's impossible to hear every piece of legislation, let alone get it up for a vote. Uh, but it also means the political agenda means some issues are just going to get shelved. Could be a lack of power for the legislator that's introducing the bill. Another legislator who doesn't like that bill might be trying to find ways to tank that bill by knocking it down the agenda, not even so much trying to kill it in a committee. They just try to or they try to kill it in the committee. If they don't, they just bury it down the ledger. Anyways, who the leadership is in that legislature sets the tone for what the agenda is. And while Congress meets the vast majority of the year, minus a couple of those recesses, almost every state legislature meets for a much shorter period of time. Mentioned that earlier. Most of them are only one or more like 2 to 6 months long. Some of them might be close to the length that Congress meets up for, but a state's regular session could be as short as 30 days. So a lot of these state legislatures they don't meet very often. Doesn't mean they're not working. They still got town halls and constituent service and all that to do, but they're not doing the primary job that they were elected to do just because state laws just have shorter sessions. And that's whether you should have longer sessions or not, that's a whole other topic that I want to cover at some point. But uh, so just time constraints just tank a lot of bills, and it's not necessarily even anything nefarious. It's just there's just a lot of things that need to be heard, or there's other topics that are considered more pressing because they're part of the zeitgeist. They're on top of everybody's mind right now. Uh, Number two was political relationships or lack thereof. Uh, Wheeling, dealing with party members, so Republicans with Republicans, Democrats with Democrats. Sometimes you got to wheel and deal with the opposing party, especially if that opposing party has majority control of the chamber, because if they have majority control of the chamber, they control the agenda. So you sometimes need to have a little give and take with them. Even if a legislator is not on the outs with the legislative leadership, that leadership may have built relationships with other legislators who get their bills heard first. So it's not even necessarily anything that particular legislator did. It's just the other legislators are more buddy buddy with the leadership than this other one is. And then rank and file members, generally speaking, are less often going to get bills heard and passed because they're new, they're trying to forge relationships, they're trying to learn how everything works. So you really need those political relationships to really uh, be productive. Because if you don't have those relationships, it's going to be a very, very long session for you. And the third big reason I want to highlight for why so many bills die so early is poorly written and or sloppy bills. Regardless of the party or ideological leaning uh, or issue beliefs that a legislator has, some bills are just really poorly put together. Um, State constitutions and state statutes have some stipulations for how bills need to be written and what they need to include, and then the legislative chambers also have certain rules. Just because a legislator has introduced a bill, it does not mean it's a well-written bill. And I've seen some bills that are pretty like, oh boy, that's terrible. I actually just did a webinar for a public affairs firm in DC, talking about reading legislation for client impact. In other words, how to read legislation to best serve your client. And I had seen uh, an example of a bill back in like Texas, I think it was, and the bill was clearly aiming to outlaw same-sex marriage. This was something like 2006, 2007. Uh, but the way it was worded basically would have outlawed all marriage, or at least the way it was written, you could construe it to mean that. Now, that's not what the bill was actually trying to do, but if you follow the letter of the law, basically marriage would have been illegal if the bill would have been accepted, or it would have if it would have been passed. It was never going to pass because of that, but that's just to go to show you that there are some of these issues where the bill just isn't written well. It might require a lot more in-depth change than the bill author thinks it does, especially if they're new to this whole thing. They might have to make a major change to a regulatory structure by executive agencies. So, executive agencies, some a lot within the law that is prescribed to them, they have some leeway as to determining how to best fulfill those functions and legal duties. And so, if a legislator tries to pass a bill that really affects them, that can really cause a lot of headaches. Not necessarily that that's inherently a bad bill. It's just that it's a lot of other stuff that needs to be considered. Uh, Circular definitions of key terms. There are some bills will define a thing as a thing. Like, I mean, I can't think of a specific instance off the top of my head, but like, if you said a door is a door, basically, there are bills that have been written kind of like that, or at least have a lot more language, but ultimately then become that circular definition. So it's not necessarily obvious that that's what the bill does, but some bills do that. Uh, a bill might be too ambiguous. So if you read the wording, it might be so ambiguous that it's unenforceable, or it gets enforced a certain way that a bill author doesn't intend, or it is enforced in a way that it's that the bill author intended it to be enforced by, uh, but it was written in a way to make it more palatable, if that makes sense. The bill might be too broad or narrow in scope, and that's just really going to depend on. It's just really a case by case basis. But bills, and usually if it's about how broad or narrow a bill is, it'll be debated within a legislative chamber, but it can still relate to how poorly a bill is written. And then you also have single subject rules. Uh, so 43 states' constitutions require legislation to be about a single subject. So it can't be about education and then to be about healthcare. Theoretically, it's pretty straightforward. And that single subject rule does not exist for Congress. It's only 43 of the state legislators. Only 43. It's a lot of the state legislatures, but there are a few that don't have that. But what constitutes a single subject isn't necessarily clear, because it just, the state constitutions, if you read the passage for the single subject rule, it just says something along the lines of legislation can only tackle one subject. Okay, but what kind of that may seem obvious, but that's not actually a straightforward thing. A good example I saw of it was apples and oranges. Oh yeah, those are two different subjects. You're talking about apples and oranges. Those are totally different kinds of fruit. But they're both fruit, so they are therefore a single subject. So you can have that same kind of conversation possibly with legislation and say like, no, this is actually one subject, or no, this is not one subject. That has been the subject uh, of lawsuits in various states in the past. So uh, just a thing to keep in mind. The impact of these poorly written bills, if it's poorly written, it's inherently going to affect the productivity of the legislature, because the legislature, a committee, is going to have to hear that bill and waste their time with a badly written bill. That legislator wasted their time drafting that bill. So could really cause headaches for everybody. The committee's time has been wasted because they had to hear that bill. They're just going to say, we can't do this because of all these issues that the bill is going to have. So we're not going to bother moving it forward. And then so that bill doesn't move forward. And then the fourth big reason that a lot of bills die so early, or at least the fourth one I'm highlighting in this episode of the podcast, is a bill might not follow proper legislative procedure. Now, legislatures have many of the same rules, but there are for how a bill has to be introduced, what guidelines it has to follow. Legislatures have handbooks for their members that they give them, and then some of these are also available for the public to see online. So these legislative procedures about how they introduce bills, how they are called on to speak about their bill, how debates are had, how amendments to bills are introduced, how substitute bills are introduced, all these kinds of procedures. There's a lot of similarities across states, but there can be some key differences between them. But if a legislator does not follow legislative procedure, their their bill is not going to be going anywhere, because well, if it has to follow rules, if it doesn't, if you don't follow the rules and you just let it go because it didn't, even though it didn't follow rules, then what's the point of the rules? So if a bill does not follow legislative procedure, you can basically say that you can just forget about it because it's not going to be going anywhere. So those are the four big reasons I wanted to highlight for why bills die so early. So we've established several big reasons why so many bills die so early. But is it really that bad a thing that so many of these bills ultimately go nowhere, even if they get past the committee stage? Uh, Really, actually, depending on the bill, that can be a good or bad thing. It can certainly be frustrating seeing so much legislation be ultimately for naught, because it feels like a waste. You have thousands and thousands and thousands of bills over time that have just not, they either haven't been heard by the chamber floor, or they haven't even gotten out of the committee stage, or they may have gotten to the chamber floor, but they passed, maybe they even passed one of the two chambers of a state legislative body, but the governor didn't, but the other state legislative chamber didn't sign off on it. Maybe both state legislative chambers signed off on it, but the governor didn't sign off on it, or in the case of Congress, maybe the president didn't sign off on it. Yeah, it can be frustrating to see that, but not every bill is a good bill. Now, what constitutes a good bill is obviously going to be some matter of debate, a lot of it based on party and ideology and issue leanings. But let's refer back to those reasons we just talked about for why so many bills die, especially early on in the legislative process, like the committee uh, hearings, or in the committee stage. Time constraints. This can be a bad thing that bills die due to time constraints if that time is not managed well, especially with these state legislatures that only meet for a few months in a year. But even with efficient spending of time, many bills are just not going to be heard or voted on, let alone pass, because you just can't. There's just too many of them. Uh, or how about the political relationships? It could be a bad thing if bills die early, because certain relationships might be used to undermine bills, depending on what the content is. But at the same time, leveraging political relationships to get a bill passed isn't inherently good either. So, whether it's ultimately a bad thing that a bill dies because of that wheeling and dealing behind the scenes, not necessarily an obvious answer to that. The poorly written or sloppy bills. If it's a badly written bill, if it's truly just sucks, it's a good thing it doesn't pass. And that's not necessarily just because it could make a bad policy. And let's forget a moment what we consider good or bad policy. Let's say there's something that, even if something had the right idea, if we all agree that it had the right idea, uh, so it could have theoretically been a good idea, but it could introduce all if a bill is poorly written, it could introduce all sorts of other issues like potential lawsuits about the meaning of that bill or of that law if it becomes if it gets passed into law. There could be confusion about what the law means if it's poorly written to begin with. There could be haphazard executive branch enforcement because the executive branch doesn't know exactly how to enforce that law. So all these things that you got to think about down the road. So if a bill were to become law and cause all those issues, it's a good thing if that bill dies early on. And then if it did not follow this legislative procedure, again, if a bill doesn't follow the rules, you can't just pass the bill or even really entertain it much, because then you have to start making exceptions for other bills that don't follow the rules. And then what's the point of having those legislative procedural rules? One of those bills might have what you would consider good content, but you still got to follow the rules. So you have all those reasons why bills can die so early, and it might be a good thing that a bill died early because of any one of those issues, or it might not be. So, all in all, I'm not trying to say it is or isn't a good thing that many bills get drafted but ultimately fail at some point. But it is to demonstrate how it can complicate the answer as to whether or not Congress and state legislatures are productive. Speaking of which, how do we define productivity? Many citizens trash Congress as a do nothing body, and probably a lot of state legislatures too. But are they truly being unproductive when it comes to passing legislation? Those kinds of criticisms could also be uh, because of partisan or ideological biases. But there's a lot of things to complain about when it comes to Congress, but evaluating how productive they are isn't so straightforward. So, if we take the typical conception of productivity as enacting a bunch of the bills that get introduced. So we say percentage enactment rate. So the percentage of bills that get enacted out of those that get introduced. What is an ideal percentage of bills to enact? And or does that ideal percentage even exist? So we go back to a couple of those studies for state legislative bills, like in Arkansas back in first half of 2016, where 94% of the pieces of legislation had passed. Again, you compare it to Congress, where a single session, it doesn't even break 10%, doesn't even break 9%. So if you're basing productivity on the percentage of enacted bills, Congress, yeah, of course, Congress is going to look unproductive. But again, is that necessarily a good indicator of the productivity in Congress? Because we really need to, like many times in politics, we need to come up with a clearer definition of our terms. And in this case, we need to have a more clear idea of what productivity is, because debating and passing bills is not the only thing that legislators do. It's not the only part of their job. They, in the case of Congress, they confirm presidential appointees, and then in state legislatures, they confirm various gubernatorial appointees. Uh, these legislators go back to their district to interact with constituents, such as with town halls. They travel to foreign countries for business, such as negotiating ends to wars or trade deals. There's a lot of different things they could do. Yeah, obviously the main thing that you elected them for is to draft bills that you think would be good and then get those enacted, but that's not the only thing they do. So it can be pretty hard, or not pretty hard, but it can be kind of complicated to define productivity. But because we've looked at the passing of bills as the main metric, we'll mostly focus on that for here. It's just think about other ways that you can define productivity. But let's just say that getting bills enacted, the high percentage of bills getting enacted is what we want, and that's what defines productivity. Some other things that you want to consider if that is your benchmark for a legislator or legislature being productive, or you hear somebody else criticize a legislature as unproductive. Uh, is it just a matter of how many bills they pass? Is it the sheer number of bills or the proportion of bills? So, is sheer number of bills that they introduce, or the proportion of bills that they enact? So, if I get 1,500 bills enacted in a congressional session, but we introduced 25,000 of them, is that productive? Because that's a pretty low percentage. Now, what if it was, we passed 1,500 bills, but we only introduced 11,000 bills total this session? It's a much higher percentage. You still had the same number of bills passed, but you had a much higher percentage of enactment rate. So you had a much higher success rate in getting bills passed. Which one of those was more productive? Is it because the same number of bills succeeded, you just had a lot more tries with one of those examples? So that's one thing to think about when you consider if a legislature is being productive based on the number of bills that get enacted. Do we also care about which topics are being addressed by bills? So the ones that get all the fanfare and all the talk in the media, yeah, those are the ones that are the most salient topics generally. But there are a lot of bills that we don't hear about that also get passed. So if a whole bunch of those are getting passed, but not the ones that are about the most salient topics, does that also mean that legislature is being, if they don't get those big bills passed, does that mean that legislature was not being productive? Uh, what defines an important topic, quote unquote? Do they have to be landmark bills? Like, I mean, it's hard to get as landmark as this, but the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Uh, what is the threshold that we need it to be landmark for, and does that threshold indicate that a legislature is being productive, even if they're not getting a whole bunch of all these other bills being passed that otherwise don't get really any fanfare? Another thing to consider is how sizable are the bills that are being passed, because some bills are a lot longer than other ones are. And you actually look at the text, it's pages upon pages upon pages, whereas other bills might just simply be changing like two sentences. Back to that GovTrack analysis, since World War II, Congress has typically enacted 4 to 6 million words of new law in each term of Congress. So every 2 years, because term of Congress is split up into two sessions. Should have specified that towards the beginning, but now I said it. Which citizens, groups, etc., are being benefited most by this past legislation? If they're benefiting from this legislation, I'm sure they think that the legislature is being very productive, whereas these groups and these citizens that don't like these bills might not consider that legislature productive. I mean, they might, but you just got to remember that the partisan and ideological leanings of people can color their judgment as to whether they think a legislature is productive. And then lastly, does productive equal getting good policies being passed? If bad, quote unquote, policies are being passed, is that still productive? All these things here that you really got to consider. So I'm not trying to say that these legislatures are not do nothing bodies. I'm not saying they are do nothing bodies. It's just we oftentimes levy that charge and we don't really think about what exactly constitutes productivity. And that's what a lot of these studies, both the ones I cited earlier and ones I didn't have the chance to cite, they've really tried to tackle this question about what constitutes productivity, because a lot of times in politics we don't really define the terms that we're using, and this is one of those times. So we really need to figure out how to determine productivity. And uh, even if we did say productivity is simply the number of bills you get passed, well, okay, if a legislature is being productive but they're passing what somebody is going to consider a bad policy, was that really being productive? Does productive just mean the sheer amount of output that you have, or does it mean is it referring to how positive your impact is on politics? So, bunch of things for all of you to consider. But that's going to be it for today's episode of Politics with Paul. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share with all the people you know. Help this channel grow. Help this whole thing I'm trying to do grow here, because really enjoy doing this kind of thing and trying to provide a nonpartisan look at all these topics that don't necessarily get uh, a lot of attention, that aren't necessarily taught well. Hopefully, I'm teaching it well. But again, thank you so much for tuning in. Links in the show notes: Facebook, LinkedIn, my short educational email course about mistakes made when we try to depolarize people that sometimes unintentionally increase polarization, why those mistakes are made, and how we can uh, uh, fix those mistakes. Link to my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive, uh, and a couple of other things as well. But again, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.